4 a.m., Marsh Harbor Boatyards, Abaco, Bahamas, April 5, 2026. A man stumbles through the gate. He is barely holding himself upright, dehydrated, disoriented, clothes soaked. A security guard named Edward Smith is working the overnight shift when another employee flags him down. There is a man on the property. He is muttering something about a key, something about a woman still in the water. Smith approaches him, gets him water, takes one look and calls the police. Officers arrive at 5 a.m. The man's name is Brian Hooker. He is 58 years old, a former United States Marine from Onstead, Michigan. He tells the officers that his wife fell overboard from their dinghy hours ago somewhere in the dark waters between Hope Town and their anchored sailboat. He says the engine died. He says the current took her. He says he tried. His wife's name is Lynette Hooker. She is 55 years old, and as of this moment, she is nowhere to be found. That is his story. The water has a different one. Before we go any further, a quick note. This episode covers an active federal missing person investigation. The details are serious, and the case is still unfolding. No graphic descriptions are used throughout, but the subject matter is heavy. Please watch accordingly. If you are new here, welcome to True Crime Files. This channel covers active cases, follows the evidence, and does not move on until there are answers. Every episode is built on verified facts, not speculation. This case is developing in real time. New information is surfacing weekly. If you are not subscribed, you will miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button now, turn on the bell, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Now, to understand what happened that night, you first need to know who Lynette Hooker was. Lynette Hooker was not a passive passenger in her own life. She was 55 years old, a mother, and a woman who had spent decades around water. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, confirmed to the Associated Press that Lynette grew up near lakes, around boats, swimming and sailing from a young age. Her daughter, Carly Aylesworth, described her as physically capable, determined, and not the kind of person who simply falls off a boat. In 2020, Lynette and Brian sold their home in Kentwood, Michigan. They found a 1980 Morgan 461 sailboat in Rockport, Texas, a 46-foot charter vessel that needed work. They bought it, restored it, named it Soulmate, and left the shore behind. What followed was more than 4 years of documented sailing life: Louisiana, Florida, the Bahamas. The YouTube channel, The Sailing Hookers, captured all of it, cooking on a solar oven in the cockpit. Paddleboarding in Marsh Harbor, navigating unfamiliar channels in changing weather. On March 28, 2026, Lynette posted what would become her final TikTok. She wrote that she was not going anywhere for a while. 7 days later, she was gone. Brian Hooker, 58, a former U.S. Marine, had been by her side through all of it. 25 years together, more than a decade on the water, both of them experienced, both of them capable. By the first weekend of April 2026, they were anchored in the Abacos, one of the most popular sailing destinations in the Caribbean. What happened on the evening of April 4th is the question this entire investigation is trying to answer. April 4th, 2026, began as an ordinary Saturday in the Abacos. Brian and Lynette spent the afternoon at Tahiti Beach. Drinking was reported throughout those afternoon hours, confirmed through accounts later shared by Lynette's family. By approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the couple had moved to the Abaco Inn in Hope Town, a waterfront bar well known to the sailing community in that area. They stayed for roughly 3 hours. Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, later confirmed publicly what they consumed: 2 rum and cokes each, Cuba Libres, 2 drinks apiece, on top of whatever they had during the afternoon at Tahiti Beach. Both had been drinking for several hours by the time they left. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Brian and Lynette boarded their 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy and headed towards Soulmate, anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Key. It was a short trip across familiar water. They had made it before. They did not make it that night. According to Brian's account to the Royal Bahamas Police Force, Lynette went overboard somewhere between Hope Town and the boat. He said building winds and choppy seas caused her to fall. He said she was wearing the engine's safety lanyard, the kill switch cord connected to the ignition key, and when she entered the water, the engine cut off automatically. He said he threw a flotation device toward her. He said he paddled, but the wind and current pushed him further away. He said he last saw her swimming toward shore before losing sight of her entirely. What followed, according to Brian, was 8 to 9 hours of drifting westward across the open sea of Abaco, covering roughly 4 miles, before washing ashore at Marsh Harbor boat yards at 4 a.m. During those 9 hours, he placed no phone call. He sent no distress signal. He did not fire a flare. Richard Cook, fire team lead with Hope Town Volunteer Fire and Rescue, confirmed publicly that Lynette was not wearing a personal flotation device when she went into the water, though Brian stated he threw one to her after she fell. Brian Hooker arrived at the boatyard in the early hours of April 5th, and from the moment he walked through that gate, the questions started. When Brian Hooker arrived at Marsh Harbor boatyards, Edward Smith was working the overnight shift. Another employee flagged him down first. There was a man on the property, barely coherent, saying something about a key and a woman in the water. Smith got him water and called the police. Officers arrived at 5 a.m. Brian was described as exhausted and thirsty. Smith's account became the first independent confirmation of Brian's physical condition when he arrived. Sunday morning, the Royal Bahamas Police Force launched a full search and rescue operation. Drone technology, professional divers, local fire and rescue teams, and the Royal Bahamas Defense Force were all deployed. Origin Delevo of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force confirmed publicly that searches continued despite difficult weather conditions. The U.S. Coast Guard joined with aerial support. The initial operation ran for 6 hours and found nothing. One piece of physical evidence was recovered: the flotation device Brian said he threw to Lynette. Commissioner Shanta Knowles later confirmed it was the only physical evidence retrieved from the water. Brian posted a statement to Facebook that same morning. He said he was heartbroken. He said winds and currents had separated them despite everything he did to reach her. He said finding her was his only focus. Lynette's daughter, Carly Aylesworth, received a voicemail from Brian approximately 24 hours after her mother disappeared. He told her search and rescue had found the flotation device. That was the last time she heard from him directly. She hired an attorney within days and told CNN her first questions were immediate and specific. Why did he not drop anchor, and why did he paddle away from her rather than toward her? Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, was on the road back from the Bahamian consulate in Miami trying to secure an emergency passport. When she told the Associated Press she had not heard from Brian in nearly 2 days. The family, she said, was still in shock and holding on for a positive outcome. By midweek, the search had quietly shifted. Authorities told NBC that after reviewing tide, drift, and wind data, they were running out of places to look. 4 days after Lynette disappeared, investigators made a decision. Brian Hooker was no longer being treated as a grieving husband. He was being treated as a suspect. April 8, 2026. 4 days after Lynette Hooker disappeared, the Royal Bahamas Police Force took her husband into custody. RBPF Assistant Commissioner Edvardo Dames told Reuters the arrest was made for additional questioning based on probable cause investigators had developed. Brian's Bahamian attorney, Terrell Butler, later clarified the sequence. Her client had initially been brought in as a witness. He told officers he had legal representation. They assured him the interview was informal. He sat with them for over 3 hours. When they asked him to return for further questioning, he declined without his attorney present. He was taken into custody at 7:20 p.m. that evening, transporting to Nassau, and later moved to the Grand Bahama Police Station in Freeport. During one of those police transports by boat, something unusual happened. According to Terrell Butler, Brian went overboard while handcuffed in rough seas. He was pulled out of the water and sustained minor injuries. His legal team confirmed the incident. On April 10th, investigators questioned him for over 3 hours about his relationship with Lynette and whether he had caused her any harm. Butler described her client during this period as heartbroken and deeply distressed. His legal position never shifted. Terrell Butler stated publicly and consistently that Brian Hooker categorically and unequivocally denied any wrongdoing and had been cooperating fully with authorities throughout. On April 13th, Commissioner Shanta Knowles announced Brian was being released after prosecutors were consulted. No charges were filed at that time. He remained a named suspect. The investigation remained open. Butler told NBC that during the final interview, which lasted less than an hour, police presented no new evidence. Brian walked out of the Central Police Station in Freeport without answering reporters' questions. He told NBC his focus was returning to search for his wife. The following day, April 14th, he boarded a flight back to the United States. His attorney explained his mother was gravely ill and he needed to be at her bedside. Bahamian police were notified of his departure. Back in Michigan, Brian retained a second attorney, Crystal Marie Horser, based in Grand Rapids. She told ABC News her client had never stopped cooperating and asked the public to extend him the same consideration they would want for themselves. Brian Hooker was released, but released is not the same as cleared, and while he was on a plane back to Michigan, investigators were already pulling apart his story piece by piece. Investigators do not build cases on single contradictions, they build them on patterns. And in Brian Hooker's account of April 4th, the pattern of contradictions runs from the weather all the way to his own recorded words. Start with the conditions he described. Brian told the Royal Bahamas Police Force that he was battling 18 to 22 knot winds and 2 to 4 foot seas, conditions he said made it physically impossible to paddle back toward Lynette. But Aunt Pat's Bay is not open water. It sits in the lee of Elbow Key, meaning the island itself acts as a natural barrier between the anchorage and the full force of the open ocean. That is precisely why sailors choose to anchor there. Verified marine weather data from the night of April 4th does not support 2 to 4 foot seas in that protected bay on that particular evening. The conditions Brian described belong to open ocean sailing, not a sheltered Easter weekend anchorage. Then there are the currents. Brian claimed powerful tidal flows dragged him 4 miles westward over 9 hours, making any attempt to turn back impossible. Sailors, fishermen, and locals who have worked those waters for years have all said the same thing independently: there are no significant currents in that area. The bonefishing flats near White Sound Channel run ankle to knee deep in sections. This is not water that generates the kind of tidal force Brian described. What makes this detail more complicated is what surfaced in recorded communications reviewed during the investigation. Brian referenced flood tides, ebb tides, and midnight water conditions with a level of precision and confidence that does not belong to someone unfamiliar with local tidal patterns. He had been navigating those waters for weeks. He knew them. Then there is the question of 9 hours with no witnesses. Saturday night before Easter is one of the busiest boating weekends of the year in the Abarcos. Aunt Pat's Bay had multiple boats at anchor. Houses lined the shore of Elbow Key. Boats were transiting the area throughout the evening. Every experienced sailor interviewed on this subject has said the same thing: the culture of the sea does not allow for someone visibly struggling in a small vessel to go unnoticed. If you can see someone in distress on the water, you go to them. It is not a written rule. It does not need to be. Not one boat came to Brian Hooker in 9 hours. The keys present their own problem. Brian's account depends on Lynette having been wearing the engine's safety lanyard, the ignition kill switch, on her wrist when she went overboard. When she entered the water, the engine cut off. That detail is the mechanical foundation of his explanation for why the dinghy lost power. Carly Aylesworth said publicly she did not believe her mother would have been holding those keys. Remove that detail and the account requires an entirely different explanation for the same outcome. The phone adds another layer. People close to the couple confirmed the Hookers always had their phones with them on the water. Brian was adrift for 9 hours. No call was made. No electronic distress signal was sent. No documented attempt to contact anyone was made across that entire period. And then there is what Brian said in his own words. On April 7th, 3 days after Lynette disappeared, a friend of the couple named Blaine Stevenson called Brian. Stevenson recorded that call without Brian's knowledge and later made it public. He said the sailing community was best positioned to assess whether Brian's account held up physically and that the public deserved to hear Brian speak for himself. In that call, Brian described the events of April 4th as a cascade of failures. The recording is now part of the public record and has been reviewed by investigators. Every one of those inconsistencies matters, but one piece of evidence that has been almost entirely overlooked could settle several of them at once, and it walked out of a police station on Brian Hooker's wrist. On April 14th, the day after his release, Brian Hooker returned to the Central Police Station in Freeport with his attorney Terrell Butler to collect his personal belongings. Fox News Digital photographed that moment. He walked out with his wedding ring and his watch. That watch matters more than most people have recognized. GPS-enabled watches worn by active sailors and outdoor athletes record continuous positional data, location coordinates, movement patterns, heart rate, and timestamps, in some cases updating every second across an entire recording period. A watch worn from the Abaco Inn at 7:30 p.m. through to the boatyard at 4 a.m. would contain a timestamped GPS trail of every location Brian Hooker occupied during those hours, not his version of events, the actual coordinates. That watch left police custody before its data status was publicly confirmed by investigators. Whether that data was extracted and preserved before it was returned is a question investigators have not answered on the record. If it exists and was secured, it either places Brian Hooker exactly where he said he was across those 9 hours, or it does not. There is no neutral version of that information. The watch is one open question. There is another piece of evidence that exists, that is confirmed, and that the public has not seen. The last place Brian and Lynette were together has cameras. The Abaco Inn in Hopetown has surveillance cameras. That is confirmed. Footage covering the evening of April 4th, the full period Brian and Lynette were present from approximately 4:30 p.m. through to their departure somewhere between 7 and 7:30 p.m., exists and is currently in the custody of Bahamian authorities. The inn has been instructed not to release it publicly, which is standard procedure during an active investigation. What that footage can potentially answer is significant. The exact departure time sits inside a 30-minute window right now. In a case where every minute of the timeline carries investigative weight, that gap matters. The footage also recorded the observable interaction between Brian and Lynette during those final hours together. The bartenders and staff working that evening are witnesses whose accounts have not been fully reported in any public forum. When and if this case moves toward formal charges or prosecution, that footage will enter the record. While investigators hold that footage, federal agents have gone public with something else entirely, a search that has activated an entire community of sailors across the Atlantic seaboard. May 5, 2026. Exactly 1 month after Lynette Hooker disappeared, the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service posted on social media. The post was tagged breaking. Attached to it were 2 grainy photographs of an unidentified sailboat. The message was direct. CGIS is asking the public for information about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker within Aunt Pat's Bay, Bahamas, April 4th. CGIS is looking for the owner of the sailboat moored near the sailing vessel Soulmate. A Coast Guard memo obtained by CBS News added a specific detail. The owners or occupants of that vessel may have information relevant to the CGIS investigation. Understanding what that means requires understanding who CGIS is. The Coast Guard Investigative Service is the criminal investigative arm of the U.S. Coast Guard. Its agents are sworn federal law enforcement officers operating in direct coordination with the Department of Justice. They do not post public appeals on social media for routine matters. When CGIS asks the entire country to help identify a boat, there is a substantive investigative reason behind it. CBS News separately confirmed that CGIS agents were actively conducting interviews in connection with this case at the time of the appeal. The photographs they released showed a mast and a hull. No name was legible. Most people who looked at those images saw nothing usable. A researcher named Alvaro looked closer. He took those photographs and processed them technically, pulling detail out of the image that was not immediately visible. What emerged from that work was significantly clearer than what CGIS had published. The name on that boat read Azura, Azura. Azura was anchored directly alongside Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4, 2026. In a protected anchorage where boats sit close together and sailors spend their evenings watching the water around them, Azura's crew had a direct line of sight to everything that happened or did not happen on that boat that night. The sailing world is smaller than most people realize. Sailors track each other across anchorages, monitor vessel movements on AIS, and cross paths repeatedly through marinas from Marsh Harbor to Nassau to Fort Lauderdale. Somewhere in that network, someone knows Azura. If you are in the sailing community and that name means anything to you, if you have seen that boat in any marina or anchorage anywhere along the East Coast or through the Caribbean, please submit a tip through the CGIS Tips app. The link is in the description. Anonymous tips are accepted. This is how cases like this move forward. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now, because when Azura's crew is identified, you will want to be here for that episode. Azura's crew may not even know they are being searched for. They may be anchored somewhere in the Caribbean right now, completely unaware that federal agents have spent a month trying to find them. But if they were on that boat on the night of April 4th, there are 4 specific questions this investigation needs them to answer. The first is the most fundamental. Brian's account requires Soulmate to have been completely dark and unoccupied from approximately 7:45 p.m. onward. If Azura's crew observed any light, movement, or activity on that boat after that time, the stated timeline falls apart. In a protected anchorage where neighboring boats sit within clear sightlines of each other, that is not a small detail. The second involves the dinghy. In Brian's account, it never came back to Soulmate. It was recovered the following morning drifting miles away in open water. Sailors pay close attention to dinghy movements at anchor. Theft is a genuine concern and people notice. Did anyone on Azura see that dinghy return to the boat that evening? The third question is the one that stops investigators cold. At least 3 witnesses who were together that evening reported seeing a single flare rise at approximately 8 p.m. on April 4th. They said it appeared to originate from the direction of Soulmate. If that account is accurate, someone fired a distress signal from a boat that was supposed to be empty. A flare is not fired accidentally. It is not fired by an unoccupied vessel. Did Azura's crew see it? The fourth question is practical. Many sailors run forward-facing security cameras, motion-activated lighting, or onboard monitoring systems while anchored. If Azura had any recording equipment active on the night of April 4th, investigators need that footage. The relevant evidence may not be obvious. It could appear incidentally in the background of footage triggered by something completely routine. Whatever is on those recordings, it belongs in the hands of CGIS. Azura is the unknown, but there is someone who is known, an experienced sailor who stopped asking questions about Brian's account and started physically testing it. Blaine Stevenson is an experienced sailor who knew both Brian and Lynette Hooker personally. He runs a YouTube channel called Sailing Cameo. He is also the person who recorded the April 7th phone call with Brian and made it public, a decision he said he made because the sailing community was best positioned to judge whether Brian's account was physically possible on the water, and because the public deserved to hear Brian's version of events in his own words. For weeks after that, Stevenson worked through the case from a seamanship perspective, examining the geography, the conditions, the equipment. This week he stopped analyzing and started demonstrating. The vessel Brian and Lynette were in that night was an 8-foot hard-hull rigid dinghy, fiberglass construction, hard bottom, hard sides. Stevenson's test vessel was 10 feet long, rigid plastic construction, weighing 220 pounds, 2 feet longer than Brian's dinghy, with more surface area exposed to wind and more weight to move through water. By any measure, harder to maneuver than what Brian was operating. For wind conditions, Stevenson waited until sustained readings were above 18 knots, with gusts reaching 22, matching the range Brian described for the night of April 4th. He then paddled back to his boat using a single oar. He made it in under 2 minutes. While he was out there, 3 separate boats altered course to check on him. Their crews saw a man paddling a rigid dinghy in building winds and came immediately. That is standard sea culture. If someone looks like they might need help on the water, you go to them without waiting to be asked. Brian Hooker says he was out there for 9 hours. Not one boat came. Stevenson told CBS News what he wanted Brian to hear directly. They trusted you with their loved one, and you did not live up to it. The demonstration answers one question directly, but there is a background to this case that investigators have not ignored, a history that Lynette's family has not stayed quiet about. Carly Aylesworth has been the most publicly consistent voice in this investigation from the family's side. She has said her mother would not simply fall from a boat. She has described the relationship between her mother and Brian as having a documented history of conflict, particularly when both were drinking, and she told Fox News directly that she considered it volatile. The public record supports part of that picture. In 2015, a domestic incident in Kentwood, Michigan, produced a police report in which Brian told officers Lynette had struck him in the face multiple times. Lynette, described in that same report as highly intoxicated, told officers Brian had struck her in the forehead and choked her. Officers documented no visible injuries on Lynette. A prosecutor reviewed the case, determined there was insufficient evidence to establish who initiated the altercation, and dismissed it. No charges were filed against either party. In 2006, Brian was acquitted by a Michigan jury on a child abuse charge involving children from a previous relationship. The case did not result in a conviction. None of this establishes guilt in connection with Lynette's disappearance. Both of Brian's attorneys, Terrell Butler and Crystal Marie Horser, have stated he categorically denies any wrongdoing. Aylesworth herself has been clear about where she stands. She does not want anything bad to happen to Brian. She wants answers. That is what the record shows. Investigators are weighing all of it, the history, the account, the evidence, and the questions that remain open. Here is where the investigation stands right now. As of early May 2026, Lynette Hooker has been missing for more than 30 days. No body has been recovered. The single flotation device remains the only physical evidence retrieved from the water. Bahamian search operations have wound down. Officials confirmed to NBC that after modeling tide, drift, and wind data, they have exhausted their operational search parameters. The Royal Bahamas Police Force investigation, however, remains active. Brian Hooker remains a named suspect. No charges have been filed in the Bahamas or anywhere in the United States. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service is now carrying a federal criminal investigation running parallel to the Bahamian inquiry. CGIS has confirmed active interviews are ongoing and public cooperation is being actively sought. Their authority extends directly into Department of Justice jurisdiction. Brian Hooker is in Michigan. Crystal Marie Horser confirmed he is cooperating. Before leaving the Bahamas, he told reporters something that has stayed with many people following this case, that his one job was to look out for her and that it had not happened. Fox News has reported that if formal charges are brought in the Bahamas, extradition from the United States remains a legal avenue available to prosecutors. The investigation is open. The questions are unanswered, and there are specific, concrete pieces of this case that still need resolving before anyone can say they know what happened in Aunt Pat's Bay on April 4th. 6 questions sit at the center of this investigation, without public answers. Azura, who are they, where are they now, and what did they witness from that anchorage on the night of April 4th? This is the active federal priority that could shift the entire case. The watch data was the GPS information extracted before that device left police custody. If it was, What does it show? If it was not, whether that data is still recoverable is itself a critical question. The Abaco in footage. It exists, it is confirmed, and it has not been seen publicly. What does it show about the precise departure time and the observable dynamic between Brian and Lynette that evening? The flare, at least 3 witnesses reported it. It has not been formally addressed in any public statement from investigators. Who fired it, and from exactly where? The phone, 9 hours on the water with no call placed. Cell tower records and device activity logs from that night have not been publicly accounted for in any reporting. And finally, the legal threshold. What specific evidence are Bahamian authorities and CGIS assembling before a charging decision is made, and how close is that threshold to being reached? Every one of these questions has an answer somewhere. The investigation has not finished finding them. Lynette Hooker did not stumble into this life, she chose it. She and Brian sold the house, found the boat, did the work, and left Michigan behind because she wanted open water more than she wanted a fixed address. The ocean was not something that happened to her. It was a decision she made with both hands. Her Instagram captures that clearly: meals on a solar oven, mornings anchored in quiet bays, reefs explored from below the surface. A woman who was exactly where she intended to be. She has now been missing for more than 30 days. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, is waiting for answers from across an ocean. Her daughter, Carly Aylesworth, has not stopped pushing publicly for a full investigation since the first day she heard the news. True Crime Files is not closing this case. Every development that surfaces, every legal move, every tip, every time the name Azura appears anywhere in the sailing community, we will be here covering it. If you have any information about that night, about Azura, about anything connected to the waters around Elbow Key on April 4th, submit it through the CGIS Tips app. The link is in the description. Tips are anonymous and the app is free. One piece of information from the right person could move this entire investigation forward. Subscribe to this channel now, not as a formality, because this case is active, it is developing, and the next update could come before the week is out. Hit the bell, leave a comment, tell us what you think happened that night. Lynette Hooker loved the water. She deserves the truth. We are staying on this until we find it.